A School of Her Own by Arletta Richardson. Chapter 15. Mrs. Lawton Speaks Out. Land's sakes, Mabel! If you aren't exhausted, I am. Can't you sit down for 10 minutes at least? Augusta stirred the stew that bubbled on the stove as she watched me make my 100th trip to the window. I can't help it, Augusta. Dr. Mason went over there last night. He promised he'd stop by on the way back and tell us how Len is. Why hasn't he come? Wearing out my kitchen floor won't bring him any faster, she said. You're not going to be fit to go to school tomorrow if you don't settle. I know you're worried, she added a little more kindly. But Len is in the Lord's hands. There's nothing any of us can do but trust. I know, I replied. Sarah Jane always reminds me that patience is not my most prominent virtue. But whatever will I do if Len should die? Suddenly, I burst into a flood of tears, and Augusta turned back to the stove, embarrassed. Alice hurried to put her arm around my shoulder. Len is young and strong, she said. Many people have lived through scarlet fever. And remember that the Lord says, "My strength is made perfect in weakness." You know he'll never send us more than we can bear with his help. That's right, Augusta chimed in. Don't borrow trouble. When Len dies, then you worry about what you'll do. Alice glared at Augusta, but I had to smile at her attempt to encourage me. You're right, Augusta. I should have more faith. I wiped away my tears. I'll set the table for supper. That will redeem the time, won't it? Augusta nodded. And while you're at it, set a place for the doctor. I busied myself with the dishes and silverware. While I was slicing the bread, Alice called from the window. He's coming, Mabel. I rushed for the door and, ignoring the freezing cold, raced out into the yard to meet the doctor as he descended from the sleigh. Is he all right? Is Len all right? Do you want to get sick too? We can't stand out here in the cold and talk. Dr. Mason hurried me back into the kitchen, and when he had taken off his heavy coat, he sank heavily into a chair. Len is going to get well, he said, and I dissolved into tears again. This time, Augusta looked disgusted. If you don't beat all, 10 minutes ago you were wailing because you thought Len would die. Now you're blubbering because he didn't. She shook her head. I'm certainly glad I was never a foolish young girl. Your memory is short, Augusta, the doctor commented. Augusta sniffed, and as she went back to the stove, I saw her wipe her cheek with the edge of her apron. The doctor turned back to us. I was afraid we were going to lose him last night. He's had a terribly high fever, but it dropped toward morning, and he's resting now. It will take a while for him to regain his strength, but he's on his way. I think you girls can go back home in another week. Supper was a joyous meal. Len was getting better. I couldn't wait to get back home. When we packed our things to leave, Augusta was sorry to see us go, although she didn't admit it in so many words. There are advantages to living alone, she said. When you find a hair in the honey, you know it's your own, but I recognize my duty when I see it. If you need shelter again, I can make room for you. I imagine it will seem pretty quiet for a while without all your chatter. Not that I couldn't stand a little peaceful silence. Impulsively, I hugged her. You've taken good care of us, Augusta. We really appreciate it. We'll miss you. Oh, pshaw! I only did what any decent Christian would do. Of course, I know some very good Christians who wouldn't live with 2 flibberty-gibbets for 3 weeks. The Williams were glad to welcome us home. These have been the longest 3 weeks of my life, Len's mother admitted. I couldn't have gotten through it if I hadn't known that everyone was praying for us. But now spring will soon be here and everything will be back to normal. I was shocked at how white and thin Len looked, but he smiled brightly. Aren't you glad I was so considerate as to get sick while you were both gone? He asked. I usually like to share whatever I have with my loved ones, but I was glad to make an exception this time. I couldn't find an answer to his comment. Did his loved ones include me, or was that just a chance phrase? With the coming of spring, Russ's letters became more frequent and more insistent. I shared the latest letter and my uncertainty with Sarah Jane. Dear Mabel, we will be having a week's holiday in April, and I would like to spend some time with you. I thought you'd want to know that my father has purchased land for our house. As soon as we decide on the plans, the building can begin. I know you wanted more time before we set a date, but you can see how important it is to start planning for the future. The next 3 years will go by so quickly."
"You seem to be the only one who hasn't made up your mind," Sarah Jane commented. "Russ and his father certainly have no doubts."
"I know," I replied, "and common sense tells me that I should be enthusiastic about his offer. After this year, I'd enjoy having someone look after me. I like Russ. I could live with him and be happy. What am I waiting for?"
"I think you're waiting for someone you can't live without," Sarah Jane said. "Or maybe you've already found him."
"Len?"
I shook my head.
"I may feel that way, but he doesn't. I didn't realize how much I thought of him until I was afraid he might die. Besides, the first time I saw him, no, it was the second time, he said he would never ask anyone to share what he makes as a country preacher."
"I seem to recall you're saying you'd never marry a minister either," Sarah Jane reminded me. "Never must be the most often eaten word in the English language. I guess you have to decide whether you'll settle for a sure thing and accept Russ or hold out for what you really want and wait for Len."
"You're a bundle of help. If you had to make a choice between Thomas and someone else, you wouldn't think it was such an easy decision."
"True, but it would be my choice. I can't make up your mind for you, Mabel."
"I don't believe what I hear," I told her. "Since when are you reluctant to set me on the right way?"
Sarah Jane looked serious. "This is a matter of your entire future life," she replied. "I can't be responsible for that."
Though I had not seen him, Cy Lawton was indeed back home. When I walked to school one morning several weeks later, I found him standing by the schoolyard fence. He opened the gate and followed me into the yard. I was not about to be followed into the building, so I waited by the steps to see what he wanted.
"I don't suppose you know where Abe went?"
"No, I don't."
"And I don't suppose you'd tell me if you did," he continued.
"Why would you want to know?"
I burst out indignantly.
"Apparently, the boy was nothing but an irritation to you. You should have been reported for the way you treated him."
"I was reported," Cy replied. "Elizabeth thinks it was you as done it."
"Elizabeth is wrong. I've not talked to anyone but your wife. If I were going to tell someone, I wouldn't have waited until Abe was gone to do it."
Cy regarded me silently.
"You're pretty little to be so sassy," he said finally. "I just come by to tell you that if Abe shows up and there's a trial, you'd better keep your mouth shut. How I bring up my boy ain't none of your business. And if I was you, I wouldn't meddle. You understand?"
I was frightened, but the anger I felt overshadowed the fear.
"Good day, Mr. Lawton,"
I said.
"I have work to do."
I was thankful to see some of the children approaching and to watch Cy Lawton disappear in the opposite direction. When I reached my desk, I was trembling so that I couldn't put the day's lessons on the board for several minutes. I had decided that since Abe was gone, I would not need to say anything to Len or Mr. Williams about what I knew. Now I was not so sure. As far as I was aware, Abe was the only member of the family who had actually been mistreated. But Cy Lawton was dangerous. It might no longer be safe to keep the matter to myself. When I returned home in the afternoon, I found Mrs. Lawton seated in the kitchen with Len and his parents.
"I'm glad you're home, Mabel," Mr. Williams said. "This concerns you too. Mrs. Lawton has told us why you were visiting her on the day of the storm. You did the right thing by trying to have the problems settled inside the family, but you should have let us know that Cy was coming to the school. You could have been in danger." "She says that Cy thinks you reported him to the authorities," Len put in. "She was afraid he would try to see you about it." I sat down at the table.
"He did,"
I said.
"He was there this morning."
I repeated the conversation between us and told Len and Mr. Williams all I had observed until the time Abe left. I did not mention the main reason for my silence, that I was afraid that Len might really care about Elizabeth. Mrs. Lawton listened to my story, and then she spoke.
"Elizabeth doesn't know," she said, "but I'm the one who reported Cy." When he turned Miss O'Dell out into the storm, I couldn't stand it no more. He left home because he thought he'd be held responsible if she died. She didn't, so he came back. That's when I made up my mind to speak out."
Mr. Williams looked grim.
"I thank you, Mrs. Lawton, for coming here. I'll see that this matter is taken care of."
The relief I felt was overwhelming. I had been more frightened than I would honestly admit, even to myself. End of chapter 15.